The man at the counter admitted he couldn't pay before he'd even looked at the menu. Ellie Marsh was closing out the register at the end of a slow Tuesday shift when he sat down, gaunt and hollow-eyed in a way that had nothing to do with fashion, his hands folded carefully in front of him like he was trying to take up less space than he actually occupied. "Just coffee," he said, not meeting her eyes. "That's all I need." "You look like you need more than coffee," Ellie said, setting the mug down anyway. His jaw tightened. "I don't have enough for a full meal tonight. Coffee's fine." Ellie glanced toward the kitchen window, where 2 rolls of bread sat leftover from the day's baking, destined for the trash within the hour regardless of what she did with them now. She wrapped them in a napkin without asking permission from anyone and slid them across the counter. "On the house," she said. "The kitchen was made extra. Don't worry about it." The man's eyes lifted to hers for the first time, something raw and startled moving behind his exhaustion. "You don't know me." "I know you're hungry," Ellie said simply. "That's enough." He ate slowly, methodically, like someone relearning what a full meal felt like, and when he finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you," he said, like the words carried more weight than the sentence itself. "You have no idea what tonight actually meant." Ellie thought nothing more of it, wiping down the counter, closing out the register, going home to her small apartment above a laundromat in New Orleans's Bywater neighborhood, without a second thought toward the stranger she'd fed for free. She had no idea that the gaunt, exhausted man was Antonio Ferraro, a name that commanded fear and deference across half the city, who had walked into her diner unannounced and unguarded after a brutal, bloody week, needing one single hour where nobody recognized his name or feared his presence. He returned 4 days later in a different world entirely. This time he wore a tailored suit, 2 men trailing him at a respectful distance, and the diner's entire atmosphere shifted the moment he crossed the threshold, Ellie's manager straightening instinctively, other customers lowering their voices without quite understanding why. Ellie recognized him immediately and felt her stomach drop with quiet, dawning horror. "You," she said, staring at the composed, powerful man who'd been a starving stranger 4 nights earlier. "Me," Antonio confirmed, something almost like amusement in his controlled voice. "I believe I owe you 2 rolls of bread." "You don't owe me anything," Ellie said automatically, though her voice wavered slightly. "I told you it was in the house." "I'd still like to pay," Antonio said, sliding a bill across the counter that made Ellie's eyes widen, considerably more than any meal in the diner had ever cost. "Triple what I owe. For the bread, and for treating me like an ordinary man when I very much needed that." "I can't accept that," Ellie said, pushing it back toward him. "It's too much." Something shifted behind Antonio's composed expression, surprise, then a kind of genuine, unguarded respect. "Most people don't refuse money." "I'm not most people," Ellie said, though she had no idea yet how completely that simple refusal was about to upend the careful, exhausting stability of her entire ordinary life. Ellie Marsh was 26 years old, and the modest studio apartment she rented above a laundromat represented the entire fragile structure of a life built alone, carefully, after her father's construction accident 3 years earlier left their family without his income and without the health insurance that might have covered his recovery properly. She worked full-time at the Bayou Diner, a small, family-run establishment that had employed her since she was 19, a job that paid modestly but had become, over the years, something closer to a second home than simple employment. Her financial pressure was constant and specific. A portion of every paycheck went toward her father's ongoing physical therapy costs and rent that consumed a larger share of her income than she was entirely comfortable with, leaving little room for anything beyond careful, exact necessity. Her personal goal, held close and rarely discussed with coworkers, was simply to help her father regain enough mobility to return to some kind of work himself, easing the financial pressure that had defined her family's life since his accident. It was a modest goal, not glamorous, but it was hers, and she'd built her entire adult routine around pursuing it patiently. Her emotional wound ran deep and specific. She'd watched her father's dignity erode during his recovery, watched him struggle silently with the shame of needing help he'd never required before, and she'd promised herself, Watching that quiet suffering, that she would never make anyone feel small or embarrassed for needing kindness, that she would give what she could without ever making the receiving of it feel like a debt. Her moral boundary was simple and unbending. She helped when she could, without calculating the cost or expecting anything back, because calculating kindness too carefully felt, to her, like the first step toward becoming someone who stopped noticing need in others at all. Her practical skill, sharpened through years of helping the diner's aging owner, Sal, manage the books during slow shifts, was a careful, detailed understanding of invoicing, wholesale pricing, and the small financial patterns that kept a modest restaurant solvent, a skill she'd never been formally trained for, but had absorbed through simple, patient attention to numbers nobody else bothered double-checking. The recurring object she carried, tucked into her apron pocket every shift, was a small, cracked wooden rosary that had belonged to her grandmother, not for religious observance exactly, but as a private, physical reminder of the quiet, patient generosity her grandmother had modeled throughout Ellie's entire childhood. The week before Antonio first walked into the diner, Ellie had spent her own evening, unpaid, helping Sal reconcile a confusing batch of wholesale invoices that had left him anxious and overwhelmed, staying 2 hours past her shift because watching an elderly man she cared about struggle with something she could easily help untangle felt like exactly the kind of quiet abandonment she refused to participate in. That same instinct, automatic, unglamorous, entirely without calculation, was exactly what sent her wrapping 2 rolls of bread for a stranger without a second thought toward who he might be or what accepting nothing in return might eventually cost her. Standing behind the counter after Antonio's second, considerably more startling visit, Ellie found herself replaying the strange, dissonant collision of the gaunt, hungry stranger and the composed, powerful man who'd apparently been the same person all along. "I need to understand why you keep trying to pay me for something I already told you is free," she said, once his security had settled at a respectful distance and the diner's usual rhythm had resumed around them. "Because generosity that expects nothing back is rare enough that I don't know how to simply accept it and walk away," Antonio said. "I'd rather overpay than let it go unacknowledged entirely." "I don't want to be acknowledged," Ellie said. "I want you to understand that what I did wasn't a transaction. If you turn it into one now, it stops being what it actually was." Something in Antonio's careful expression shifted, recognition, maybe, or a kind of respect that went deeper than simple gratitude. "That's a remarkable amount of clarity," he said, "for someone who fed a stranger without asking a single question first." "I've had a lot of practice being clear about what I will and won't accept," Ellie said. "It comes with learning to give carefully, without letting it become something it was never meant to be." She had no idea yet how completely that careful clarity was about to be tested by considerably more than a stranger's overpaid bill. Antonio Ferraro became a regular at the Bayou Diner over the following weeks, always requesting Ellie's section, always polite, always treating her with the same careful, unremarkable respect he'd extend to anyone competent at their job. Never flirtatious, never performative, just genuinely, consistently present. "You don't have to keep coming back," Ellie told him, during one slow afternoon shift, setting down his usual order without being asked. "Whatever debt you think you owe me for 2 rolls of bread, it's long since been settled by every tip you've tried to leave since." "I'm not coming back out of obligation," Antonio said. "I find myself genuinely appreciating this diner. And your company, if I'm honest." "That's not really an answer to why," Ellie said. Antonio was quiet for a moment, something considering behind his composed expression. "Most people who learn who I am either grow afraid or grow calculating," he said finally. "You've done neither. You still argue with me about accepting extra money. That's rarer than you'd think." "Who exactly are you?" Ellie asked, though something in his careful phrasing suggested she already half suspected the answer. "My family has distribution and logistics interests across the city," Antonio said carefully. "Also, other interests, older ones, that come with a name that carries weight if you know New Orleans well enough to recognize it." "Ferraro," Ellie said slowly, piecing together fragments of neighborhood conversation she'd half-registered over the years without fully connecting them. "Mafia. That's the word people use," Antonio said, not denying it. Every instinct pulled Ellie to retreat fully into professional distance, but something about his directness, offered without excuse, without minimizing what it meant, kept her curiosity engaged despite her wariness. "Why tell me the truth?" she asked. "You could have kept it vague." "Because you fed me without asking who I was," Antonio said. "Lying to you now, after that, would just be an insult to what you actually did." Their conversation was interrupted by Sal, the diner's aging owner, emerging from the back office with a stack of invoices and visible, uncharacteristic anxiety on his weathered face. "Ellie, can you look at this when you have a minute?" he asked. "The wholesale bill from the distribution company came in again, and I swear these numbers don't match what we agreed to last quarter." "I'll look at it after my shift," Ellie said automatically, though something in Sal's tension made her uneasy. Antonio's attention sharpened with visible interest. "What distribution company?" "Crescent City Wholesale," Sal said, not recognizing the significance of Antonio's question. "We've used them for years. Lately the invoices keep creeping up, and I can't figure out why." Antonio's expression shifted into something carefully controlled. "That's one of my company's distribution arms," he said quietly, once Sal had returned to the back office. "Managed under a partnership with an associate of mine, Marcus Greco." Ellie's stomach tightened with sudden unease. "You're telling me your own business might be overcharging this diner?" "I'm telling you I need to understand exactly what's happening in those invoices," Antonio said. "Would you be willing to show me?" Ellie hesitated, professional caution warring with growing concern for Sal's obvious anxiety. "I handle the books here during slow shifts. I could probably spot a discrepancy pretty quickly if there's one." She pulled the invoices from the back office, spreading them across a booth table, her careful, detail-oriented attention surfacing instinctively as she cross-referenced the numbers against Sal's original contract terms. "This is nearly double the agreed rate," she said, tapping a specific line item. "Consistently over the past 4 months. That's not a rounding error. That's deliberate." Antonio studied the documentation with unexpected sharpness. "My own accountants haven't flagged this." "Your accountants probably aren't personally reconciling a small diner's monthly invoices," Ellie said. "I am, because Sal's been like family to me for years, and I don't like watching him struggle with something I can actually help untangle." Something shifted fully open in Antonio's composed expression, genuine, unguarded respect. "You just identified something my own financial team missed entirely." "I didn't do anything remarkable," Ellie said. "I just paid attention to numbers that mattered to someone I care about." "That's exactly what makes it remarkable," Antonio said. "Most people wouldn't bother noticing this discrepancy at all, let alone catching at this precisely." Ellie studied the invoices again, something uneasy settling in her chest. "What does this actually mean? If your own company's overcharging Sal, that's not just a paperwork error." "It might mean considerably more than a paperwork error," Antonio said grimly. "I need to look into this properly. Would you be willing to keep me informed if you notice anything else unusual?" Ellie hesitated, weighing genuine concern for Sal against her instinctive wariness about becoming entangled in Antonio's world. "For Sal's sake," she said finally. "Not for any other reason." "That's all I'm asking," Antonio said, though something in his careful, grateful expression suggested it meant considerably more to him than he was letting on. Antonio's investigation into the overbilling accelerated over the following 2 weeks, and Ellie found herself drawn increasingly into details she'd never intended to become involved with, cross-referencing Sal's invoices against her own careful memory of wholesale pricing from a previous job at a supplier, noticing patterns that meant nothing to her in isolation but, apparently, everything once connected to Antonio's own growing concerns. "This isn't isolated to Sal's diner," Antonio told her during one evening visit after closing, his composed exterior edged with controlled fury. "My people found the same inflated billing pattern across at least 6 other small businesses connected to Crescent City Wholesale's distribution routes." "Your partner's been doing this for a while, then," Ellie said, absorbing the scope of what her simple observation had apparently uncovered. "Marcus Greco has run that distribution arm for 6 years," Antonio said. "I trusted him completely. This kind of systematic overbilling across multiple accounts for this long, that's not a mistake. That's a deliberate scheme." Ellie's practical instincts, sharpened by years of careful bookkeeping, kept working even as the implications sharpened around them. If this has been going on for years, there's probably a paper trail beyond just the invoices. Handwritten notes, maybe, or something in the delivery logs that don't match official records. That would help enormously, Antonio said. But Ellie, if Marcus realizes you're the one who first noticed the discrepancy, connecting all of this. I didn't think about that, Ellie admitted, unease sharpening in her chest. The external consequence of Antonio's investigation arrived faster than either anticipated. Marcus Greco, apparently sensing scrutiny approaching, contacted Sal directly, threatening the diner's lease through a shell company Marcus quietly controlled, a legal maneuver dressed up as routine business, but unmistakably retaliatory in its timing. They're trying to force me out, Sal told Ellie, showing her the lease notice with trembling hands. After 30 years running this place, some paperwork I've never heard of before is suddenly threatening to end everything. Ellie called Antonio immediately, fury cutting through her exhaustion. Marcus is threatening Sal's lease. This is retaliation for the invoices, isn't it? I believe so, Antonio said, his own voice tight with barely controlled anger. I'm addressing it directly. Sal's lease isn't going anywhere. The consequence escalated further within days. Ellie returned to her apartment to find it had been searched, nothing dramatically disturbed, but drawers left deliberately ajar, and her personal notebook, where she'd been keeping careful, handwritten notes about the invoice discrepancies for her own reference, missing entirely from where she'd left it. She called Antonio, hands shaking. Someone broke into my apartment. They took my notes about the invoices. Antonio's response was instant, sharp with alarm. Don't stay there tonight. I'm sending a car. Antonio, I told you I wanted to help Sal, not get pulled into your world. I know, he said, genuine regret unmistakable in his voice. I'm sorry this cost you as much as it already has. But I need you somewhere I can actually protect you while we finish exposing exactly what Marcus has been doing. Ellie's instinctive independence flared, even through real fear. I'm not disappearing into hiding. I have a job. Sal needs me at the diner, especially with everything happening to his lease. I'm not asking you to disappear, Antonio said. I want to add protection around the diner, and I need you to stay somewhere secure temporarily. You keep working. Sal stays fully informed about everything happening. I'm not interested in taking away either of those things from you. Ellie considered his careful, specific offer, weighing genuine fear against her fierce reluctance to let her independence dissolve into his world entirely. If I do this, she said finally, the diner stays open. Sal knows everything, every step. This isn't permission for you to manage my life beyond what's actually necessary. Agreed completely, Antonio said without hesitation. Whatever you need. The following morning, Antonio's men arrived at the diner, discreet but visible enough that Sal understood immediately something serious was unfolding around his small business. You should have told me sooner, Sal said to Ellie, though his tone carried more concern than anger. I don't want you in danger because of my invoices. You didn't do anything wrong, Ellie said firmly. Marcus Greco did. I'm not going to let him scare either of us into silence about it. She packed a small bag that evening under the watchful eye of Antonio's driver, her grandmother's cracked wooden rosary tucked carefully into her coat pocket, and didn't look back at the apartment she'd called home for 3 years. Whatever came next, there was no simple path back to her ordinary, careful independence anymore. The secured townhouse where Ellie now stayed under Antonio's protection became, over the following days, less a temporary safe house and more a strange, complicated space neither of them fully acknowledged out loud. Scene 1 came the next morning, practical and immediate. Ellie found Antonio in the kitchen before dawn, reviewing financial documents with the same exacting focus she brought to Sal's invoices, a legal pad covered in careful cross-references. You've been at this all night, she said, setting coffee beside him without being asked. I keep finding more accounts, Antonio said. Small businesses, mostly family-run, exactly like Sal's diner. Marcus specifically targeted people unlikely to have the resources to challenge inflated billing. That's a particularly cruel kind of theft, Ellie said, settling into the chair across from him. Taking from people who can least afford to lose it. It is, Antonio agreed. And it happened under an arrangement I personally trusted for 6 years without questioning it closely enough. Scene 2 arrived 3 days later, an argument sharper than either expected. Antonio announced, over a quiet dinner, that he wanted to move Sal into protected housing as well, given the escalating threats connected to the lease. Sal won't leave the diner, Ellie said immediately. That place is his entire life. Uprooting him isn't protection, it's taking away the one thing he has left. Ellie, if Marcus escalates further, then we protect the diner itself, more security around the building, but you don't get to keep expanding what protection means every time you get nervous, she said, voice rising with genuine frustration. Sal spent 30 years building that place. I'm not going to let fear take it away from him, even temporarily. Antonio sat back, absorbing the force of it, and for the first time, actually paused instead of immediately defending his position. You're right, he said finally. Tell me what would actually work instead. Ellie's anger softened at the honesty. Increase security around the diner itself. Let Sal stay where he's built his entire life. Done, Antonio said, meaning it. Scene 3 came on the 7th night, when Ellie found him alone on the townhouse's back terrace, a glass of wine he wasn't drinking held loosely in one hand. There's a family 2 blocks from here, Antonio said, before she'd even asked what was on his mind. The Delgados. The father lost his job 8 months ago. I've been quietly covering their grocery bill at the corner market ever since. Nobody knows, not even them. I set it up through the store owner directly, no name attached. Why are you telling me this now? Ellie asked, something warm and unexpected settling in her chest. Because I think you're the only person who'd actually understand why I do it without asking, Antonio said. I grew up watching my own father struggle with pride around accepting help, even when we genuinely needed it. I learned early that the kindest way to give something is to make sure nobody has to feel the weight of receiving it. That's exactly why I gave you that bread without asking questions, Ellie said quietly. I didn't want you to feel like accepting it meant anything beyond a full stomach for one night. I know, Antonio said, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. That's exactly what I recognized in you from that very first night. The same instinct I've been operating on my entire adult life, in someone who had no idea who I was and nothing to gain from it. Ellie sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. I think that's the first time you've told anyone about the Delgados. It is, Antonio admitted. I don't usually explain that part of myself to anyone. Most people in my world would call it a liability, sentiment that doesn't serve any strategic purpose. It's not a liability, Ellie said. It's the most honest thing about you, probably. They sat in silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the city lights spreading beyond the terrace, and something passed between them that wasn't yet spoken but was undeniably present. 2 people who'd both learned, through different kinds of hardship, exactly how much courage genuine, quiet generosity actually required. It was Marco, Antonio's head of security, who broke the moment, appearing at the terrace door, tablet in hand, expression tight. Antonio, he said. I finally cross-referenced the invoice handwriting against something from years back. Notes Marcus Greco left with a supplier Ellie used to work for, before she came to the diner. Ellie's brow furrowed. I worked for a produce supplier for about a year, before the diner. Why would Marcus's handwriting be in their records? Because he apparently ran a similar overbilling scheme there too, years earlier, Marco said. The handwriting on these older supplier notes matches the recent invoice adjustments precisely. This isn't new. Marcus has been doing this for considerably longer than 6 years. Antonio's expression went cold and absolute. That confirms it completely. Not isolated to our current partnership. A pattern he's been running for over a decade, across multiple businesses. Whatever fragile calm they'd built over the past week had just shifted into something considerably more consequential. Ellie, staring at the old supplier notes Marco had pulled, felt a strange, unsettling recognition stirring in her memory. I think I actually met Marcus once, years ago, at that produce supplier job. I didn't know his name at the time, just a man who came in occasionally to review invoices with the owner. I remember him specifically because he always seemed irritated when anyone asked too many questions about the pricing. That's consistent with someone actively hiding fraud, Antonio said grimly. You've unknowingly been connected to this for years, without ever realizing it. That's an unsettling thought, Ellie admitted. It's also exactly the kind of detail that could matter enormously, Antonio said. If you can identify his handwriting confidently, connect it to what you remember from that old job, it strengthens the case against him considerably. Ellie studied the old notes carefully, her detail-oriented memory working through years-old fragments. I'm fairly confident, she said finally. The way he crosses his sevens, the specific slant, that matches what I remember. Antonio's jaw tightened, something resolving fully behind his controlled expression. Then we have enough to move forward. The full scope of Marcus Greco's fraud, once Antonio's investigators traced it completely, revealed a scheme considerably larger and longer-running than anyone had initially suspected. Over a decade of systematic overbilling across dozens of small businesses, funneling significant sums into accounts Marcus controlled personally, all while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate, trusted business partner. He's been doing this since before our current partnership even began, Antonio said, studying the full evidence with grim understanding. Using every business relationship he's ever managed as an opportunity to quietly skim from people least likely to notice or challenge it. And I helped catch it by accident, Ellie said, still absorbing the scope of what her simple observation about Sal's invoices had eventually uncovered. You caught what my own trained accountants missed for years, Antonio said. That's not an accident. That's genuine attention to detail that finally mattered. Marcus, apparently sensing the net tightening around him, moved fast once he realized both the invoice discrepancy and the old supplier connection had been traced back to him definitively. He escalated the threat against Sal's lease into something considerably more direct, and simultaneously, Ellie received an anonymous, chilling message. Stop digging into things that aren't your business, or the diner won't be the only thing that suffers. Ellie's hands shook as she showed it to Antonio. He's threatening me directly now. Then we move faster than he expects, Antonio said, voice going cold and absolute. I want this exposed completely, evidence strong enough that Marcus can't simply threaten his way out of consequences. The confrontation happened faster than anyone anticipated. Ellie, returning to the diner the following afternoon to check on Sal, found her path blocked near the back entrance by a man she didn't immediately recognize, but whose careful, deliberate stance raised every instinct she'd developed over the past tense weeks. You've caused Marcus quite a lot of trouble, the man said, his voice low and controlled in a way that sent immediate alarm through her. A waitress with a good memory for handwriting. Inconvenient. Antonio's people already have everything they need, Ellie said, backing carefully toward the diner's main entrance, calculating distance with the same steady instinct she'd developed managing difficult moments behind the counter. Whatever happens to me now doesn't erase what's already been connected. Maybe not, the man said, closing the distance. But it removes the one witness who could testify to recognizing his handwriting specifically. Ellie's pulse hammered, but her voice stayed steadier than she felt. You're not thinking clearly. If something happens to me now, right after Marcus's fraud has already been connected to multiple accounts, that makes him look considerably guiltier, not less. Something in the man's expression flickered, genuine calculation warring with cornered urgency. Before he could respond, Antonio's security, alerted moments earlier by a check-in call Ellie had made out of careful habit, closed the distance and restrained him before he could act further. In the sudden, ringing quiet afterward, Antonio arrived personally, checking her carefully, his composed authority cracking into raw, visible relief. Are you hurt? Ellie, look at me. I'm okay, she managed, hands finally shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. We're okay. That evening, Antonio gathered his senior associates, laying out the full evidence, the invoice discrepancies across multiple businesses, the old supplier notes connecting Marcus's handwriting to a decade-long pattern, Ellie's testimony about the threat and the attempted intimidation, and the room's reaction confirmed exactly how difficult the coming decision would be. Marcus built the distribution partnership that's sustained significant revenue for years, argued Enzo Bellandi, one of Antonio's senior advisors. Exposing him publicly doesn't just end his career. It requires dissolving the entire distribution monopoly structure he helped build, which costs this company considerable revenue going forward. And if I don't dissolve it? Antonio asked. Marcus continues operating exactly the way he has been, using the structure I helped maintain as cover for fraud against people who have nothing to do with any of it. He already threatened Ellie directly to protect himself. Silence isn't protecting this company at this point. It's just protecting Marcus's ability to keep doing this. There's real financial cost in dissolving the monopoly structure, Enzo warned. I know, Antonio said. I'm doing it anyway. Ellie, listening from the doorway, stepped forward. I want to testify formally, she said. About the handwriting, about the threat, about everything I've noticed since Sal first showed me those invoices. Ellie, Marcus already tried to have you silenced once, Antonio said. Testifying publicly carries real risk. Staying quiet carries risk too, Ellie said. For me, for Sal, for every other small business he's been quietly stealing from for years. I'm not interested in hiding from this. Antonio studied her, torn between every protective instinct he had and the plain truth of what she'd said. If you testify, he said finally, you stay under full security before, during, and after. No exceptions. Agreed, Ellie said, her voice steadier than she felt. She reached into her coat pocket, fingers finding her grandmother's cracked wooden rosary, and tucked it carefully into her bag for the coming testimony, a quiet, private reminder of exactly why walking away had never really been an option. The formal investigation into Marcus Greco's fraud moved fast once Ellie's testimony and Antonio's complete evidentiary trail gave investigators everything they needed: the invoice discrepancies, the decade-old handwriting match, the documented threat against a material witness. But the deeper reckoning, the one Antonio had known was coming from the moment he decided to expose Marcus completely, arrived when dissolving the distribution monopoly that had let Marcus operate unchecked for years became unavoidable. This monopoly structure has generated significant, steady revenue for your company for over a decade, Enzo said, laying out financial projections in Antonio's office. Dissolving it doesn't just end Marcus's role. It restructures the entire distribution arm, opening it to competition your company hasn't faced in years. That's exactly the point, Antonio said. The monopoly is what let Marcus operate without real scrutiny for so long. No competitive pressure, no external audit forcing transparency. I'm not interested in preserving a structure that enabled a decade of fraud against small businesses, regardless of what it costs my own revenue going forward. It was, Ellie would understand later, the single most costly decision Antonio made throughout the entire ordeal, not the confrontation with Marcus directly, but the deliberate, complete dissolution of a distribution monopoly that had sustained significant, reliable income for his company for years, done specifically to ensure no similar fraud could ever again hide behind unchecked, unchallenged control. He announced the restructuring publicly, opening the distribution routes to competitive bidding for the first time in over a decade, while simultaneously providing investigators the full evidentiary trail connecting Marcus to fraud across dozens of accounts spanning more than 10 years. Marcus, cornered by evidence too thorough to escape, was arrested within the week, formally charged with fraud and extortion connected to the threats against Ellie and the lease manipulation targeting Sal's diner. You didn't have to dissolve the entire monopoly to get this resolved properly, Ellie told Antonio, finding him in his office 3 days after the restructuring announcement, exhausted in a way she hadn't seen from him before. I did actually, Antonio said. The monopoly was the exact structure that let Marcus operate without real scrutiny for over a decade. I can't ask people to trust that this won't happen again if I'm not willing to close the vulnerability that enabled it. That's a significant financial sacrifice, Ellie said quietly. It's the only choice I could actually live with, Antonio said. For years, I told myself that steady, profitable business structures mattered more than examining whether they carried hidden risk. Watching Marcus threaten you, watching him try to silence the one person whose careful attention actually exposed a decade of theft, that taught me something I should have understood a long time ago. He met her eyes directly. A small act of kindness, given without expectation, ended up exposing something I should have caught myself years earlier. You didn't do anything remarkable that first night, feeding a stranger bread. But it connected to everything that came after in a way neither of us could have predicted. Ellie was quiet a long moment, weighing everything he'd admitted against the fierce independence she'd fought to protect throughout this entire ordeal. I need you to understand something too, she said finally. I'm not interested in staying close to you because I feel like I owe you anything for protecting me, or dissolving your monopoly, or any of it. I gave you bread because you looked hungry. I noticed those invoices because I care about Sal. I'm not going to let gratitude replace something that has to be chosen freely, not even for you. That's exactly what I want you to understand too, Antonio said. Whatever you choose next, it has to be entirely yours. Marcus's formal prosecution moved forward over the following weeks. The evidence Ellie and Antonio had assembled together, the invoice discrepancies, the handwriting match spanning a decade, the documented threat, leaving no room for his earlier scheme to survive scrutiny. Small businesses across the city, many of whom had never realized they were being systematically overcharged, began receiving restitution as the full scope of his fraud came to light. Sal's lease threat dissolved entirely once the shell company behind it was traced directly to Marcus's now-frozen assets, the diner's 30-year legacy preserved without further complication. You didn't have to testify so thoroughly, the investigating attorney told Ellie afterward. A less detailed account would have been sufficient for the basic charges. He tried to silence me to protect a decade of stealing from people who couldn't afford to lose what he took, Ellie said simply. I wasn't interested in leaving any room for doubt. Antonio found her at the diner one evening, weeks after Marcus's arrest, the ordinary rhythm of the Bayou Diner settling back into something recognizably normal despite everything that had unfolded around it. It's over, he said. Marcus's prosecution is moving forward on solid ground. The distribution restructuring is fully underway. Whatever comes next for my company, it's built on considerably more honest terms than before. How does that feel? Ellie asked. Lighter than I expected, Antonio admitted. I spent years believing that steady, protected business structures mattered more than genuine transparency. Watching you refuse to be silenced, watching your simple kindness that first night eventually expose something I should have caught myself, I think I finally understand what actually matters more than protected revenue. What's that? Building something honest enough that it doesn't need protection from real scrutiny to survive, Antonio said quietly. 2 months later, Ellie still worked her regular shifts at the Bayou Diner, Sal's business fully stabilized, the wholesale invoices now accurate and transparent under a completely restructured distribution system. Antonio had offered her, more than once, a management position within his company's legitimate operations, generous, secure, considerably removed from the modest rhythms of diner work she'd known her entire adult life. She'd turned it down every time, gently but firmly, exactly as she'd promised herself she would. You could take on something bigger, he said one evening, finding her closing out the register at the end of a slow shift, the same counter where everything had started months earlier. You've more than earned that after everything you helped uncover. I know, Ellie said, but this diner is mine. Not because I own it, but because I built my place in it over years exactly the way I wanted to. I'm not interested in trading that away just because a bigger opportunity exists now. Then what do you want? I want you to keep being a regular here, Ellie said, something warm and certain in her voice. Not because you owe this place anything anymore. Because somewhere over the past 2 months, this became somewhere you actually wanted to be, not just somewhere you were investigating. That's already true, Antonio said, something soft moving behind his careful expression. That evening, closing up together, a routine that had become, gradually, something neither of them commented on directly anymore, Antonio found her checking the kitchen's leftover bread, the same shelf where 2 rolls had once fed a starving stranger. I still think about that first night sometimes, Ellie said, noticing him watching her. Not with any regret. More like proof of something. That small, unglamorous kindness, given without expecting anything back, actually mattered more than I could have imagined that night. It mattered more than you'll probably ever fully understand, Antonio said quietly. You have no idea what that hour meant to me, being treated like an ordinary, hungry man instead of a name people feared. She pulled her grandmother's cracked wooden rosary from her apron pocket, turning it over in her hands. She used to say that real generosity never announces itself, Ellie said. That the moment you start keeping track of what you've given, it stops being a gift and starts being a transaction. I think I finally understand completely what she meant by that. Antonio reached for her hand, deliberate and unhurried, entirely hers to accept or decline. I know I complicated your independence the moment I walked back into this diner in a tailored suit, he said. I've thought about that a lot. Whether any of this actually helped you, or whether it just handed you a different, more complicated version of the same problem. It did complicate things, Ellie admitted honestly. But you also listened every single time I pushed back. That's the difference. You didn't just decide for me and expect gratitude. You let me set the terms, even when it clearly would have been easier for you not to, even when it cost your own company real revenue to do this properly. Then let's keep building it that way, Antonio said, together on whatever terms actually work for both of us. She closed the distance between them herself, deliberate and certain, and kissed him. The choice entirely hers, made with eyes open to exactly what it had cost and exactly what it had given her in return. Ellie still wraps up leftover bread for anyone who looks like they need it, still carries her grandmother's cracked rosary in her apron pocket, still believes, more firmly now than ever, that a small act of kindness, given without expectation, can change more than anyone could ever predict in the moment it happens. If this story stayed with you, I want to know what you think. Was Ellie's kindness to a hungry stranger genuinely brave, or was she simply lucky that it turned out the way it did? Tell me your honest answer in the comments and why you believe it. If stories about quiet generosity changing everything resonate with you, subscribe. The next one is coming soon.